everybody. Now we're going to talk a little bit about that idea of character-driven plot. And before we really get into it, I want to point one out to you real quick that is amazing. This book here is called The Woman Who Wouldn't. And I'm pretty sure most of us will recognize this author here, Gene Wilder. For those of us who are old enough to remember, he was Dr. Frankenstein and Young Frankenstein, as well as many, many other lovable characters, namely the original main character in Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. He is well known for his comedy stylings as an actor, and if you've never read any of his work, you absolutely should, because it is so surprisingly different than his acting style. It's very subtle, very character driven, and not that happy that you would expect from a comedy writer. This story, The Woman Who Wouldn't, is all about two people in love who are in a relaxation, if I could speak, it'd be easier to teach, relaxation home. It's places where, like, if you were feeling overwhelmed, you would go and spend a few weeks recuperating. They used to be known as a part of like an insane asylum, but we wouldn't use that phrase. It's somewhere where you're feeling overwhelmed, kind of like rehab, but you're free to come and go within reason. They used to be really popular turn of the 19th and 20th century. And all this story is about these two people relaxing in a home, trying to get through their stress and falling in love. It's very character driven. There isn't a lot of so-called action, and it is by far one of the most amazing quick reads that I've ever read. And the characters are complex, even though we don't see them in a lot of action-y type of writing. So if you haven't checked it out, you should. Gene Wilder's The Woman Who Wouldn't. He also has another great short book. These are very short. They're around 100 pages. Called My French Whore, which is also that character-driven kind of writing. We also have another great example that we're reading today, or maybe not today, but at least this week, called Brownies, written by Z.Z. Packer. And I kind of want to talk about the idea of character-driven plot using this story. We are writing character-driven plots in this class because we're doing literary fiction. And remember, all of my genre fiction writers, you're amazing. I'm a genre fiction writer too. And so keep in mind that for this story, for this class, you can use your bigger genre fiction story. Many of us have talked about this one-on-one, and if you're not sure how exactly what I mean, let's talk, and I'll be happy to clarify with you. We don't need to have big plot reveals, big plot resolutions even. So if you have a big fantasy world story that you're working on, bring it in a little bit for this story. You're only writing 6 to 8 pages, right? You're not doing the entire story. And focus on some internal character-driven conflict that just can be a part of that big overall amazing genre story that you're writing. So even if you're writing genre fiction, you can still benefit from learning how to do character-driven literary fiction, because that character-driven plot will further enhance your genre writing. It's going to make it that much more compelling. It's going to make your characters that much more relatable. So, moving on. The story that we're reading today, or this week, is about a group of African-American brownies, the level before Girl Scouts. So they're relatively young, around 4th grade. And they're camping to earn some badges for their brownie sashes. So there's not a lot of plot going on here, right? They are at a campground, hanging out, doing crafts, that kind of stuff. The conflict comes when this African-American brownie group encounters Troop 909 that they see from afar. And Troop 909 is a bunch of white girls. So that is the inherent conflict, right? The racism. So while there's not a lot of action in this story, there is a lot of stuff going on. And by stuff, I mean the plot. That all plots have is 3 acts, most plots have, are the 3 acts, the beginning, the middle, and the end. Okay, so every story that we write needs to have a beginning, a middle, and the end. The beginning is where we meet and get introduced to the characters, get a little bit of that background, know why we should connect with these characters. And usually the initial conflict happens at the beginning. The middle is where that main conflict, and usually the reversal will happen. And remember, as Dufresne says, the reversal is where things shift. Maybe there's more complex conflict than the initial one is. Maybe the initial conflict brings something about that's unexpected. Maybe our characters react differently. Remember, the purpose of a plot is to get the characters to be where they want to be, to get them what they want. And the end, after all of that conflict and reversal, the end is where we see where our characters are now after that big conflict. So every plot has the beginning, middle, and the end. And the beginning is where we get to know the characters, the middle is where that main conflict happens, and the ending is where we learn where those characters are at now. In the story that we're reading, Brownies, the beginning, we get to know a little bit about the main characters. We've got Snot, which isn't a super great name. People are mean. Her actual name is Laurel, the narrator, but the characters refer to her as Snot. And then we have a couple of the alpha leaders. We've got Arnetta and some of her compatriots that are leading this group through their conflict. And at the beginning, we get introduced to a little bit of their background. They call Troop 909 a bunch of wet chihuahuas. And we see some lines in there where we get the feel of how this Brownie troop, is not around a lot of white population, a lot of Caucasians. They use the term Caucasian to be an insult. And we learn a lot of this in that first couple chapters, first couple pages of this story. We see some rising action. Okay, we see the initial conflict, and that's where Daphne, our quiet one, who doesn't really speak at all through the entire story until the end, Arnetta overhears Troop 909 referring to Daphne as a very, very strong racial slur. Okay, and that's the initial conflict. That's the driving force, is this overhearing of a racial slur and how that inspires these girls to go for their revenge. That's the drive, that's the motivation. They're going to go teach these Troop 909 girls a lesson about racial inequality overall. They're just going to kind of get them back for using that inappropriate term, right? So that's the beginning. That's where we meet our characters. We get a little bit of their investment and that initial conflict. Now, the middle of the story is where the tension rises and we have the big climax. Okay, so these girls are spending a lot of time of the story trying to figure out how are they going to get Troop 909 alone so they can beat some sense into them, right? And if you think about how young these girls are, they're in 4th grade, you can really see the underlying current that ZZ Packer is getting at, that racism is innate, it's around us all the time, and it's deeply instilled in these girls. And so we spend most of the story up until that climax building that tension. For example, on page 568, we have the narrator being asked by Arnetta, are you going to tell on us or not? Arnetta wanted to know if she was just going to be a whiny little punk and tell on them and get in the way of perpetuating their revenge. In other words, and getting to be an active member of teaching them a lesson, or are they is Snot going to continue to perpetuate the racial slurs that go on in their life? And that's where the tension really kind of builds. Snot is being put on trial, so to speak, to pick sides. Are you going to be a wuss and continue to take all this racial inequality, or are you going to do something about it with us? You're going to go attack 909. So we have this motivation, this internal motivation, because remember, nothing's really happened yet. These girls are just kind of going through their days plotting their revenge, and yet the story is still moving forward, right? Then we have our big climactic scene in the bathroom between these girls, and we realize that these girls that our troop is going to go after and teach a lesson to are developmentally slower. They say in there that they would not use the word retarded, but these girls are clearly developmentally disabled in some way. In fact, the leader says, the troop leader says that they have one of the girls, the one that is accused of using this racial slur, has a disability in which she just apes and mimics everything that she hears. And so in all actuality, this is the big reversal, right? What Arnetta thought that she heard, she didn't actually hear or see or have a full understanding. It was a girl who didn't understand what she was saying, if indeed she said it at all when she was speaking to Daphne. If she did say it, she was mimicking something that her father may have said without actually knowing what it means. And that's the big climactic scene. There's no fighting, there's no magic being slung about, there's no real physical altercation that's going on, and yet something very big happened in this conversation. Arnetta and her group was pulled to a stop. These girls aren't necessarily capable of the powerful racial slurs that our group thought that they were. There was no vindictive racism going on, overtly anyways. As we get past that big reversal, we get towards the end, in which we see where these characters are now. It's at the very end that we realize that Snot doesn't, like, she has an actual name. Her name is Laurel. And she thinks about, after all of this, she's sitting with Daphne on the bus, and she thinks about how these girls, these developmentally disabled girls, are an example of the racism that goes through their life. It's part of their reality. And she thinks about her dad and how her dad hired Mennonites to come in and clean and paint the porch because it would be the only time her father had a white man on his knees doing something for free. That's very powerful. And again, there's not a lot of action going on, but that internal emotional conflict is driving, that character is driving the story. So we have our beginning, we have our middle, and we have our end. And it is all character driven. It is all through that misunderstanding of the racial slur and the processing, the build up to the big conflict that we were going to have. And it turns out that the conflict is really a big misconception, a misunderstanding, and the conflict becomes internalized. And then at the end, we see our characters sitting on the bus, see who they are now. Some of them, like Daphne and Laurel, have a profound realization that racism is a hand that they dealt with, and there's just something mean in the world. Now, isn't that a powerful statement? There's just something mean in the world that they have to live with. And that's really kind of a coming-of-age moment. And then we have our other characters like Arnetta and Octavia, who are back to their old ways. They're the same characters, really. They didn't learn anything from this experience. They're dealing with their racism that they have by making fun of these developmentally disabled girls. So even if we don't have a hard-hitting, action-driven plot, we have a emotionally hard-hitting, character-driven plot where we start with the characters believing one thing, and they go up through the rising action and the falling action to become either different people, or they don't really have any change at all in the case of our supporting cast, Arnetta and Octavia there. So that's a little bit of a long-winded discussion on how Brownies is really an exceptional example of character-driven plot. For our stories, I'd like to see something similar. Remember, we're writing character-driven stories, so let's take a moment in our characters' lives. Maybe if we're writing that genre fiction, take a moment in that genre action-packed, plot-driven story where we really see the character behind the wheel. Because really, there is no character without plot, but there is definitely no plot without good, well thought out, complex characters. And even in genre fiction, how our characters respond to the action that we throw them is really what drives the story. So at the heart of it, literary fiction can be genre fiction because genre fiction has elements of literary fiction. So while we're writing our first draft, hopefully we've already started it, as we're working through our first draft, really think about how your character and his or her inner motivations, that conflict, is really what pushes the story from that beginning where we get to know them to the middle where we have our climactic scene and that reversal, and then the concluding where we see where our characters are now. If you'd like to talk about this, talk it through, let's hit up the general discussion forums, or you can always connect with me. We can text, we can chat, we can talk on the phone, we can do it through email. Remember, I'm here to support you. And again, I'm sorry this one's a little bit long-winded, but we had a lot to talk about. Plot's a really big thing. If you'd like to talk about it in more depth, let me know. It's going to be amazing. Don't overthink plot. We'll work on it. It's okay if this first draft is not perfect. That's why we call it the first draft. Let's just make sure that our plot has a clear beginning, a middle, and an end, and that our characters are the one that's driving it through. All right? It's going to be great. You're going to do amazing.